the blood is everywhere. Welcome back to The Haunted Beard, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Today I want to give you my review for Abigail. This is one of my more anticipated movies of the year, the latest from Radio Silence. Just became available on demand and gave it a watch, got some thoughts, so let's get into my review. After a group of criminals kidnap the ballerina daughter of a powerful underworld figure, they retreat to an isolated mansion, unaware that they're locked inside with no normal little girl. And the isolated location they take Abigail to is this mansion. And more or less what they are doing is they are on this 24-hour babysit watch as they are holding her for a $50 million ransom that they're hoping her father is going to pay so that they can all get rich. And if you've seen any trailers or any sort of promo for this movie whatsoever, you know that Abigail is not just a ballerina, she is a vampire. And when this little girl unleashes the fangs, things get bloody. And Abigail's main selling point is the vampire carnage that occupies most of the second half of the movie. And while I thoroughly enjoyed the second half, the first half I feel like takes a little bit longer than it probably should have to get to that point. And that leads me into one of my few criticisms of the movie is you really don't get any sort of the vampire action until about the 50-minute mark. And so that first half feels a little inconsequential and a little drawn out more than it probably needed to be. Once the characters get Abigail to this mansion, it's kind of a lot of sort of downtime and kind of mellow. And I just wish it would have got to the vampire stuff a little bit sooner because that's the main selling point of the movie. Like, we already know that reveal is going to happen. We already know Abigail's a vampire. We're a step ahead of the characters in the movie. And so it's like, just get to the vampire stuff because we all know that's what's coming. So why draw it out longer than it needs to be? So I feel like the first half could have maybe been tightened up a little bit. They probably could have trimmed, at least 10, maybe 15 minutes off of it to just help the pacing a little bit and ultimately get us to the point that we're all waiting for. And so it seems like, why are you kind of prolonging the inevitable? Just get to the vampire stuff because that's why we're here, sort of thing. Now, in that first half, we are obviously introduced to our characters, and the performances here are pretty good. They're serviceable. The characters are not super well developed, or there's not really much depth to them, but it's not really that kind of a movie. We don't really need to know a whole lot about these people. In fact, one of the main things is they're criminals. They don't know each other, and so they don't want to know things about each other. There's a pretty good scene earlier on where Melissa Barrera kind of does this almost Sherlock Holmes type deduction scene where she kind of is able to deduce certain things and backstories with all of the characters. That's kind of a cool scene, but in a movie like this where it's not character driven, you don't really need a whole lot of character depth. What kind of makes up for the lack of depth in the characters is that the characters have these kind of big, loud personalities. They're kind of easily identifiable and distinguishable. Their personalities really kind of shine and are put on the surface. And so that helps. Each one kind of has their own unique sort of personality that kind of helps them stand out amongst, the other ones. And so the character work is serviceable. It does what it needs to do for a movie like this. Melissa Barrera is the one who's the most fleshed out. She's the one who kind of most attached to. I guess she would technically be kind of the official lead of the film. But even with her, there's not a whole lot of depth beyond just kind of her main sort of motivation and driving factor to why she's in this situation. Now, in terms of the plot and the story, I think what sort of best summarizes my thoughts on the story is that this movie plays out as advertised. This is a movie where you've got a cast of criminals, of characters come together in this house, and it turns out that the girl that they are trying to babysit and hold for ransom is a vampire, and eventually that's going to get out, and she's going to just start, going crazy, and things are going to get bloody. And so from a story perspective, don't go in, if you haven't seen this, expecting this to sort of redefine the vampire subgenre. There are some reveals where you kind of figure out why exactly they're there and things like that. But for the most part, it kind of plays out how you would expect It's pretty standard, kind of straightforward from a story perspective. But obviously, like I said, the main driving force is the vampire action. And let me tell you, the vampire action in this is pretty great, and I had quite a bit of fun with it. So while you're not going to get super in-depth characters, you're not going to get a super involved or complex or super engaging plot here. Really, those things are serviceable enough to ultimately service the main reason why we're watching, which is just the insane vampire action. And once that clicks into gear, the second half of this movie is a wild ride, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you come into this movie bloodthirsty, your thirst will definitely be quenched. This movie has quite a bit of insane, over-the-top, bloody vampire violence. Abigail makes great usage of practical effects. If there is any CGI blood here, it's not really noticeable or very minimal. It's all practical stuff. It's all real live blood. And let me tell you, there are gallons and buckets of blood in this movie. And it's just a whole lot of fun. And I have to commend Alicia Weir, who plays Abigail. She does a pretty solid job for this. I don't know. I think she's like 10 or 12 years old or something like that. For her, this small little child to be able to sell the physicality and the scariness and the violence and the threat of this little vampire on these full-grown adults kind of thing, she definitely pulls it off. And her performance is to be commended for that. And also just the way some of the action scenes are directed and shot and edited and stuff like that obviously help. There's a film later on in the latter half of the movie where she delivers like this monologue and she starts talking about each one of the characters individually. And she just really sells that performance, specifically in that scene. She does a really good job just nailing the just creepy vibe. Like the intimidation this little 12-year-old girl is able to convey is just really good. So she does a really solid job, and I enjoyed her performance. The film also has some dark humor to it, particularly Kevin Durant's character has some pretty funny moments. And there is kind of a silliness to it. There's a scene where they're trying to figure out, how they're going to defeat her, and one of them's like, yo, go get some garlic out of the kitchen and stuff like that. So there is kind of this silliness to it. They almost sort of play into some of the vampire tropes and stuff like that, which is kind of fun. My only other criticism with the movie is that later on towards the end of the movie, there's a couple kind of more dramatic, emotional moments that they try to pull off, and they just don't really land. It's just not really that type of a movie. Again, these characters are not ones that we're super invested with. And so some of the more emotional moments that they try to sell, they just don't really quite connect. Also, too, the last like 3 to 4 minutes of the movie don't really need to be there, in my opinion. It's not like detrimental to the film by any means, but it just kind of like, you don't really need this scene. They could have ended it like 3 or 4 minutes earlier and it would have been totally fine. But overall, like I said, if you're here for just some bloody vampire fun, you're definitely going to get it. And this thing it's funny. It's got some good humor. It's got some insane over-the-top vampire action. And it definitely will satisfy your thirst if that's why you're watching. So I would recommend it, especially if you like vampire movies. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Overall, I think I'm gonna be like a 7 out of 10 for Abigail. It's a fun time. I definitely recommend you check it out. So those are my thoughts. Hit me up down below like always. Let me know your thoughts on this. Would love to hear from you. That's all I got for you. Thank you once again so much for watching. I do greatly appreciate it. And if you got anything out of this video, go ahead and do me a favor and do not click that subscribe button unless you want to be haunted by the beard.